when 15-year-old William Hart stood in the workshop of Master Carpenter John Blackwell on a November morning in 1349 and realized that every other person in the building, the master, his wife, his journeyman, his other 2 apprentices, had died during the night of plague, leaving William alone with tools and timber and half-finished commissions, and absolutely no idea how he would survive without the structure of authority and instruction that had governed his life since he'd been apprenticed at age 12. He understood that he was facing both the greatest tragedy and the greatest opportunity of his young life, though he couldn't yet tell which would prove more significant. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. William had been apprenticed to Master Blackwell in the city of Norwich in the spring of 1346, bound by a contract that would last 7 years, during which time he would learn the carpenter's trade in exchange for room, board, and instruction, but no wages. It was a standard arrangement, the traditional way that craft skills were transmitted from master to apprentice, the path that young men without property or prospects followed to acquire the expertise that would allow them to make a living. The apprenticeship had been arranged by William's father, a small farmer from a village outside Norwich, who had 5 sons and not enough land to provide for all of them. William, as the 4th son, had no prospect of inheriting the farm, so his father had paid the apprenticeship fee to Master Blackwell and had delivered William to the workshop with instructions to work hard, obey the master, learn the trade, and not bring shame to the family. William had followed these instructions faithfully for 3 years. He'd started with the most basic task, sweeping the workshop, organizing tools, fetching materials, watching the master and journeyman work, and trying to understand what they were doing. Gradually, he'd been given more responsibility, allowed to practice with tools, under supervision, assigned simple tasks like planing boards or cutting joints, trusted with increasingly complex work as his skills developed. By November of 1349, William was a reasonably competent carpenter's apprentice. He could work independently on simple tasks, could assist with more complex jobs, understood the basic principles of the trade, even if he hadn't yet developed the refined judgment and skill that came with years of practice. Under the normal course of things, he would have continued his apprenticeship for another 4 years, gradually mastering more advanced techniques, eventually becoming a journeyman who worked for wages, and perhaps someday, if he were fortunate and saved his money, becoming a master craftsman with his own workshop and his own apprentices. But the normal course of things had been destroyed by the plague. The disease had arrived in Norwich in August of 1349, brought by ships from the continent, and had spread through the crowded city with terrifying speed. By October, hundreds were dying every week. Master Blackwell had tried to continue working through the early weeks of the outbreak, maintaining his workshop and fulfilling his commissions even as the city around them descended into chaos. But in late October, the plague had entered the Blackwell household. The master's wife had fallen ill first, followed quickly by the journeyman and one of the apprentices. Then Master Blackwell himself had shown symptoms, followed by the 2nd apprentice. William had tended them as well as he could, bringing water and food, trying to make them comfortable, praying desperately that he would be spared and that at least some of them would recover. But by the morning of November 15th, they were all dead, and William stood alone in the workshop that had been so full of life and activity just weeks before, surrounded by the tools and materials of a trade he'd barely begun to master, with no master to instruct him, no journeyman to guide him, no fellow apprentices to share the burden with. His first instinct was panic. He was 15 years old, not yet a fully trained craftsman, legally bound to an apprenticeship contract with a master who was now dead. What was he supposed to do? Return to his father's farm where there was no place for him? Try to find another master willing to take him on, continuing his apprenticeship from where it had been interrupted? Attempt to manage the workshop himself despite his limited experience and youth? The legal situation was murky. Normally, if a master died during an apprenticeship, the apprentice might be transferred to another master, or the master's widow might continue the business with a journeyman running the actual work, or the apprenticeship might be dissolved with the fee partially refunded. But these were not normal times. The plague had killed so many masters and disrupted so many households that the normal legal processes were barely functioning. No one was enforcing apprenticeship contracts or regulating the trades when half the city's population was dead or dying. William spent that first day simply trying to cope with the immediate tasks, arranging for the bodies to be removed and buried, securing the workshop, taking stock of what remained. The Blackwell household had included 6 people that morning. By evening, William was the only one left alive, and he was sleeping in the workshop rather than the house, unable to bear being in the rooms where the dead had lain. Over the following days, as the immediate shock subsided, William began to assess his situation more practically. He was alone, yes, but he was also in possession of a well-equipped workshop, valuable tools, stores of timber, and several half-finished commissions that customers would presumably still want completed. If he could finish those commissions, he could earn money. If he could earn money, he could survive. And if he could survive long enough, he might be able to establish himself as a carpenter despite his youth and incomplete training. The alternative, abandoning the workshop, trying to find another apprenticeship position, returning to his father's farm in defeat, seemed worse than attempting to continue on his own. William had been living independently for 3 years, had grown accustomed to city life, had invested enormous effort in learning the carpenter's trade. The thought of giving all that up, of returning to being a farmer's son with no prospects, was unbearable. So William made a decision that was partly courage and partly desperation. He would try to continue Master Blackwell's business, would attempt to complete the outstanding commissions, would see if he could maintain the workshop and support himself despite his age and limited experience. The first challenge was the work itself. Master Blackwell had been in the middle of several projects when the plague had struck. There was a set of doors for a merchant's house, half finished and due for delivery within 2 weeks. There were shelves for a church vestry, still in the planning stages. There was a bed frame that needed final assembly and finishing, and there were smaller items, stools, boxes, repairs that customers had left and would presumably want returned. William assessed each project, trying to determine which he could realistically complete on his own. The doors were complex, requiring precise joinery and fitting, probably beyond his current skill level. The bed frame was simpler, mostly assembly work that he'd watched Master Blackwell do many times. The small repairs and items were within his capabilities. He decided to prioritize the projects he could actually complete, would attempt the bed frame first, then the small items, and would try to negotiate with the door customer for either an extension or a refund of the deposit. It was a pragmatic approach, focused on what was achievable rather than what was ideal. Working alone was strange and frightening. William had grown accustomed to the workshop being full of activity master Blackwell directing operations, the journeyman working on complex pieces, the other apprentices handling simpler tasks, everyone contributing to a coordinated production. Now it was just William, working in silence except for the sounds of his tools, with no one to ask for advice when he encountered problems, no one to check his work before it was too late to fix mistakes. But he worked carefully, taking his time, referring to the sketches and notes that Master Blackwell had left, thinking through each step before executing it. The bed frame progressed slowly but steadily. After a week of concentrated effort, it was complete, not perfect. William could see the small imperfections that a master craftsman would have avoided, but solid and functional and acceptable. He delivered the bed frame to the customer, a wool merchant whose house was in one of Norris's better neighborhoods. The merchant examined the work critically, pointed out some of the imperfections, but ultimately accepted it and paid the agreed price. William walked away from that transaction with actual money in his pocket for the first time in his life. Not wages paid by a master, but payment for work he'd completed independently. The feeling was extraordinary. The coins were tangible proof that he could do this, that he could work as a carpenter despite his youth and incomplete training, that he could survive and possibly even thrive if he continued carefully and built his skills and reputation. Encouraged by this success, William tackled the smaller items, the stools and boxes and repairs. These were straightforward projects that he completed competently, and he delivered them to their owners and collected payment. With each transaction, his confidence grew. He was doing it. He was working as a carpenter, earning money, surviving. The doors remained a problem. They were too complex for William to complete on his own, and the merchant who'd commissioned them was growing impatient. William finally went to him, explained the situation, that Master Blackwell had died, that William was trying to continue the business but didn't yet have the skills for this particular project and offered to refund the deposit. The merchant was surprisingly understanding. Perhaps he'd lost family to the plague himself. Perhaps he recognized that a 15-year-old trying to maintain his dead master's business deserved support. Perhaps he was simply practical enough to recognize that getting his deposit back was better than having the doors never completed. He accepted the refund, wished William luck, and even mentioned that if William needed simpler work in the future, he might have projects that would be appropriate. This interaction taught William an important lesson. Honesty about his limitations could actually work in his favor. If he was upfront about what he could and couldn't do, if he didn't promise more than he could deliver, if he approached customers with humility and a genuine desire to do good work within his capabilities, many people would be supportive rather than judgmental. Through the winter of 1349 to 1350, William continued operating Master Blackwell's workshop, taking on projects that matched his skill level, declining or referring work that was beyond him, gradually building a small but steady clientele of people who valued his reasonable prices and honest approach, even if his work wasn't yet at the level of an experienced master craftsman. He also continued learning, treating each project as an opportunity to develop his skills. He studied the joints and techniques in furniture he repaired, trying to understand how master craftsmen had achieved their results. He experimented with new approaches when he wasn't working on paying commissions, using scrap wood to practice techniques he'd only observed but never performed. He asked questions of other craftsmen when he encountered them at the timber yard or the toolmaker's shop, seeking advice and guidance even though he had no formal master. The isolation was difficult. William had gone from living in a household of 6 people to living completely alone, working alone, eating alone, sleeping alone. He was 15 years old, an age when most young men would have been surrounded by family or fellow apprentices, embedded in social structures that provided companionship and support. Instead, William was radically independent, self-reliant in ways that were both empowering and sometimes overwhelmingly lonely. He dealt with the loneliness by staying busy, by focusing on work and skill development, by building relationships with customers and other craftsmen, even if those relationships were primarily professional rather than personal. And gradually, over the months, he found that the independence he'd been forced into was becoming something he valued, that the freedom to make his own decisions and set his own priorities was appealing, even though it came with heavy responsibilities. In the spring of 1350, something unexpected happened. The Norge Carpenters' Guild, which had largely ceased functioning during the plague as its members died and its normal administrative processes broke down, began to reorganize. The surviving guild members met to assess the situation, to determine which masters had died and which workshops remained viable, to figure out how to maintain the trade's standards and reputation in the aftermath of catastrophe. William was summoned to this meeting, presumably because someone had noticed that Master Blackwell's workshop was still operating despite the master's death. William went nervously, expecting to be censured or shut down or forced into a new apprenticeship arrangement that would subordinate him to another master. But the meeting went differently than he'd feared. The guild members, there were perhaps a dozen of them, survivors of a guild that had numbered more than 40 before the plague, listened to William's story of how he'd been left alone in the workshop, how he'd been completing projects on his own, how he'd been honest with customers about his limitations, while also delivering acceptable work. One of the senior masters, a man named Richard Cooper, who'd known Master Blackwell well, spoke up. The lad's been doing what needed doing. He's been honest. He's been working within his capabilities. He's not been claiming to be something he's not. In normal times, we'd say he needs more training, needs to complete his apprenticeship properly. But these aren't normal times. We've lost half our masters. We've got widows trying to run workshops. We've got journeymen setting up on their own without having earned mastership. The old system is broken. We need to adapt. Another master disagreed. But if we let apprentices become masters without proper training, we undermine the whole purpose of the guild, the whole system of quality control. How do we maintain standards if we're just letting anyone set up shop? This debate continued for some time, the guild members wrestling with the tension between maintaining traditional standards and adapting to the new reality where traditional paths to mastership had been disrupted by massive mortality. Finally, they reached a compromise. William would be allowed to continue operating his workshop, but under specific conditions. He would be designated a journeyman in practice rather than a master, acknowledging both his competence and his incomplete training. He would be required to submit to quality inspections by senior guild members who would ensure his work met acceptable standards. He would be limited in the complexity of projects. He could undertake no major commissions that required advanced skills he hadn't yet mastered, and he would be expected to continue developing his abilities, with the understanding that once he demonstrated sufficient skill through his work, he could apply for full master status. This arrangement was formalized in a document that William signed, agreeing to the conditions. It wasn't quite what the normal path to mastership would have looked like in the old system. William would have completed his apprenticeship, worked as a journeyman for several more years, created a masterpiece to demonstrate his abilities, and only then been admitted to the guild as a master craftsman. But it was a path forward, a way for William to continue working legally while acknowledging that his training was incomplete. For William, the arrangement was more than acceptable. It gave him security and legitimacy, protected him from being shut down or forced into unwanted apprenticeship arrangements, while also giving him a clear framework for continuing his development and eventually achieving full recognition as a master craftsman. Over the following years, William worked steadily within this framework, building his skills and his reputation, gradually taking on more complex projects as his abilities developed, submitting to the periodic inspections that confirmed he was maintaining acceptable quality standards. The senior guild members who conducted these inspections became informal mentors, offering advice and guidance that partially replaced the formal instruction a master would have provided. By 1353, when William was 19, he'd developed into a genuinely skilled carpenter, capable of handling most projects competently, and some with real artistry. He'd built a solid business, had regular customers who trusted his work, had accumulated savings that gave him financial security, and he'd begun to think about the next stages of development, hiring his own apprentice perhaps, expanding the workshop, taking on larger and more prestigious commissions. The guild recognized his development at their annual meeting in late 1353, formally promoting him from journeyman in practice to full master status, acknowledging that his work over the previous 4 years had demonstrated the skill and judgment that mastership required. At 19 years old, William was one of the youngest master craftsmen in Norwich's history, having achieved in 7 years what normally took 12 to 15 years of training and journeyman work. The achievement felt both earned and accidental. William had worked hard, had developed his skills through focused practice and determination, had built his business through honest dealing and quality work. But he'd also been extraordinarily fortunate or unfortunate, depending on perspective, that the plague had killed his master and left him in sole possession of a workshop at an age when he'd barely begun his training. The tragedy that had devastated his master's household had created opportunities for William that wouldn't have existed in normal times. This moral complexity troubled William sometimes. His success was built on the deaths of people he'd known and cared about. Master Blackwell, who'd been stern but fair, the journeyman who'd taught William many techniques, the other apprentices who'd been his companions. If they'd lived, William would still be an apprentice, subordinate and wage-less, years away from independence. Their deaths had given him opportunities, had accelerated his path to mastership, had made him prosperous in ways he couldn't have achieved if the plague hadn't intervened. Was it right to benefit from such tragedy? William struggled with this question, found no easy answer. He hadn't caused the plague, hadn't wished for anyone's death, hadn't done anything wrong in attempting to survive and make the most of the situation he'd been left in. But he'd also undeniably profited from catastrophe. had built his life on opportunities created by mass death. He tried to reconcile this by honoring his dead master's memory, by maintaining high standards in his work. By treating his own apprentices, he took on his first one in 1354 with the combination of firmness and fairness that Master Blackwell had modeled. He told himself that the best way to honor the dead was to live well, to use the opportunities their deaths had created to build something valuable, to pass forward the skills and knowledge they'd taught him. But the moral complexity remained, a shadow that never quite disappeared, a reminder that his success was inseparable from others' suffering, that opportunity and tragedy were often so intertwined as to be indistinguishable. As William entered his 20s and then his 30s, he became one of Norwich's most respected carpenters, known for quality work and fair dealing. He married, had children, bought a house, accumulated property, became a substantial citizen rather than a craftsman working at the margins. He served in guild leadership, helped train the next generation of carpenters, contributed to the reconstruction of Norwich as the city recovered from the plague's devastation. The plague itself receded into memory, though it returned periodically in smaller outbreaks that killed some, but never again on the scale of 1348 to 1350. The city's population gradually recovered. New people moved in to replace those who died. The normal rhythms of urban life reasserted themselves. By the 1370s, Norwich looked and felt much as it had before the plague, though with changed demographics and changed social patterns that reflected all the ways the catastrophe had reorganized English society. William's own family exemplified some of these changes. His children received more education than he'd had, were taught to read and write and keep accounts, were prepared for lives that might include commercial or professional work rather than just craft labor. His eldest son showed aptitude for carpentry and entered the trade, but as the son of a master rather than as an unpurported apprentice, inheriting a workshop and a business rather than having to build from nothing as William had. His other children had different paths. One daughter married a merchant, another entered a religious house, a son became a clerk working in city administration. This diversity of outcomes would have been unusual before the plague, when families tended to remain in the same occupation across generations, when social mobility was limited, and most people died in the same circumstances they'd been born into. But the post-plague world was more fluid, offered more pathways, created more opportunities for advancement and diversification. William's children benefited from his prosperity, yes, but they also benefited from living in a society where talent and education and economic success could create possibilities that birth alone didn't determine. William watched these developments with pride, and also with a kind of wonder at how different his children's lives were from his own youth. He'd been a farmer's fourth son with no prospects beyond a long apprenticeship and uncertain journeyman work. His children were educated, propertied, well-connected, positioned to succeed in various fields. The transformation from his circumstances to theirs had occurred in a single generation, enabled by the opportunities that the plague's catastrophe had created and that William had seized. In his 50s, William began to think about legacy, about what he would leave behind when he died. He had property and savings to pass to his children, obviously, but he also had knowledge, decades of accumulated craft expertise, understanding of techniques and materials and approaches to problems that he'd learned through experience and experimentation. How could he preserve and transmit that knowledge? He began writing slowly and laboriously, because reading and writing hadn't been part of his early education, and he'd only learned the basics as an adult. He wrote about carpentry techniques, about how to select and season timber, about joints and proportions, and the subtle judgments that distinguished good work from excellent work. He wrote about running a workshop, managing apprentices, dealing with customers, maintaining quality, while also staying profitable. And he wrote about his own story, the plague striking Master Blackwell's household. William being left alone at 15 with a workshop to run, the early struggles and gradual successes, the path from apprentice to master that had been so different from the traditional route. He wrote this not as autobiography exactly, but as a case study in adaptation, a record of how one person had responded to catastrophic disruption, how opportunity had emerged from tragedy, how new paths forward had been created when old certainties were destroyed. He gave copies of his writings to his son who'd entered the carpentry trade, hoping they would be useful. He donated a copy to the guild, thinking it might help future generations understand how the trade had adapted during the plague years. And he kept a copy for himself, a record of his life and work, and the unusual path that had brought him from apprentice to master. William died in 1389, at the age of 55, of an illness that came on suddenly and took him within days. He was buried in Norwich's cathedral churchyard, with a marker that identified him as Master Carpenter William Hart, guildsman. At his funeral, guild members and former apprentices and customers gathered to honor a man who'd been respected for his skills and his fairness and his contributions to the trade over nearly 40 years of professional life. One of his former apprentices, now a master in his own right, spoke at the funeral about what he'd learned from William. Master Hart taught me carpentry, obviously the technical skills of the trade. But he also taught me something more important, that ability matters more than birth, that honest work creates respect, that tragedy can create opportunity if you're brave enough to seize it. He was 15 years old when his master died and left him alone in a workshop. Most people would have given up, would have returned to their families, would have sought safety and security. But Master Hart chose differently. He chose to try, to risk, to build something from what seemed like complete disaster. And he succeeded. We're all here because he succeeded, all benefiting from the example he set, all carrying forward the knowledge he developed and shared. This eulogy captured something true about William's life, but it also, like most eulogies, simplified and idealized the story in ways that didn't fully acknowledge its complexities. Yes, William had seized opportunity from tragedy, but he'd also been lucky, had survived when others died, had been left in possession of resources that gave him a foundation to build from. Yes, he'd worked hard and developed his skills, but he'd also benefited from a social transformation that created opportunities for advancement that wouldn't have existed without the plague's catastrophic intervention. His success was real, was earned through effort and determination and skill, but it was also contingent on factors beyond his control, was enabled by demographic collapse and social disruption, was built on a foundation of others' suffering and death. Both things were true simultaneously. William was both a self-made man who'd built success through merit and ability, and also a beneficiary of catastrophe who'd profited from circumstances he hadn't created and couldn't have predicted. This duality earned success in fortunate circumstances. Merit and luck, individual agency, and historical forces was characteristic of the plague generation. The people who'd lived through the catastrophe, and built their lives in its aftermath. They'd had opportunities their parents never had achieved advancement that would have been impossible in the old system, had created new patterns of work and aspiration that would shape society for generations. But those opportunities came from tragedy, from the deaths of millions, from the destruction of old certainties and old social structures. The apprentices who became masters in the plague's aftermath were both fortune's favorites and survivors of catastrophe, both beneficiaries of new possibilities and witnesses to terrible loss. William Hart's life exemplified this duality. From apprentice to master in 7 years instead of 15, from propertyless youth to substantial citizen, from carpenter's apprentice to guild leader and workshop owner, his trajectory showed what was possible in the transformed post-plague world, showed how ability and determination could lead to advancement when demographic collapse created openings and opportunities. But his trajectory also showed the costs and complexities of such advancement, the moral weight of building success on catastrophe's foundation, the ways that individual stories of achievement were inseparable from collective stories of suffering and loss. William had become a master craftsman, yes, but only because his master and his fellow apprentices and thousands of others had died, creating the spaces and opportunities that his success filled. The guild that William had served and eventually led continued after his death, maintained the trade standards, and trained new generations of carpenters, adapted to changing economic conditions and evolving technologies while maintaining core traditions of craftsmanship and quality. William's writings were preserved in the guild's records, occasionally consulted by masters trying to understand historical techniques or by apprentices curious about how the trade had developed. And in those writings and the account of how a 15-year-old apprentice had been left alone in a workshop and had somehow managed to build a successful career from that unpromising beginning, future generations found a story that resonated beyond its specific historical context. It was a story about resilience and adaptation, about finding opportunity in adversity, about building forward even when circumstances seemed overwhelming, about the complex relationship between individual achievement and historical circumstance. William's story was one story among thousands from the plague generation, one path among many that people had taken through the catastrophe and its aftermath. Some who'd been left in similar circumstances had failed, had been unable to adapt or survive, had been crushed by the challenges that William had somehow overcome. Others had succeeded even more dramatically, had used the plague's disruptions to achieve advancement that dwarfed William's relatively modest rise from apprentice to master craftsman. But William's story had a particular power because it captured the essential dynamic of the plague generation, the way tragedy created opportunity, the way catastrophe forced adaptation, the way new social patterns emerged from the destruction of old ones, the way individuals navigated between agency and circumstance, between what they could control and what controlled them. The apprentice had become the master. The tragedy had created the opportunity. The old system had been destroyed, and new possibilities had emerged. William Hart's life, lived through one of history's greatest catastrophes, showed both the terrible costs of such disruptions and the genuine possibilities they created, both the suffering that mass death inflicted and the social transformation that followed in its wake. His legacy lived in the furniture he'd built, scattered now across Norwich and beyond, mostly forgotten as to its maker, but still functional, still serving purposes centuries after his hands had shaped the wood. It lived in the skills he'd taught his apprentices, passed forward through generations of craftsmen who'd learned from those he'd trained. It lived in his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all benefiting from the foundation he'd built, all living lives made possible by the success he'd achieved. And it lived in his writings, preserved in the guild records, telling the story of how one young man had faced catastrophe and had found a way forward, had seized opportunity from tragedy, had built a life and a career despite obstacles that might have crushed him, had demonstrated that even in the worst circumstances, even when everything seemed lost, adaptation was possible, success was achievable. New lives could be built from the ruins of old ones. The apprentice had become the master. The tragedy had created the opportunity, and the story, passed forward through the generations, remained as a testament to human resilience, to the complex relationship between circumstance and achievement, to the possibilities that could emerge even from the most catastrophic disruptions, to the enduring truth that endings also create beginnings, that loss opens spaces for new growth, that the destruction of old orders inevitably creates opportunities for new ones to form. William Hart had lived this truth, had embodied it in his unlikely path from orphaned apprentice to respected master craftsman. His life proved that tragedy and opportunity, suffering and advancement, loss and gain were often inseparable, that the same catastrophe that destroyed millions of lives also created possibilities for those who survived, that the plagued generation had been both cursed by terrible loss and blessed with unprecedented opportunity. This was his legacy, his story, his contribution to the ongoing human narrative of adaptation and survival, and the persistent attempt to build meaningful lives despite the catastrophes that periodically disrupt all certainties and force the creation of new laws, new lives, new social orders from the fragments of what was destroyed. The apprentice had become the master, and in that transformation, in that unlikely journey, in that complex mixing of tragedy and opportunity, something essential about human resilience and historical change had been revealed and preserved, passed forward as knowledge, as inspiration, as evidence that even the worst circumstances contain possibilities, that even the greatest tragedies create opportunities, that endings are also beginnings, and that the human capacity for adaptation and achievement persists even in perhaps, especially in the most catastrophic times.